Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Robert Roberson? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Robert Leslie Roberson III was born on November 10, 1966, and lived in Palestine, Texas. In school, he was in special education classes and dropped out in 9th grade. Years later, in 2018, he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. This disorder does not have a late onset. It begins in early childhood, even if not diagnosed until later. At various times, Robert worked as a cook, a welder, and a laborer. He also had an extensive criminal history, which I will cover in the analysis. Robert married a woman named Della, had 2 children, then divorced. In early 1999, Robert had a sexual relationship with a woman named Gwendolyn. She was a sex worker, homeless, and addicted to substances. Gwendolyn became pregnant and, on October 20, 1999, gave birth to a daughter named Nikki Curtis Bowman. Gwendolyn was denied custody of Nikki in the hospital. Therefore, Nikki went to her maternal grandparents, Larry and Verna Bowman. In November 2001, after Robert took a paternity test, the Bowmans relinquished custody of Nikki to him. 2-year-old Nikki lived with Robert in his home, along with Robert's girlfriend Teddy and Teddy's 10-year-old daughter, Rachel. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On January 28, 2002, 2 months after Robert obtained custody of Nikki, he and his mother took her to the Palestine Regional Medical Center. Nikki had been coughing, vomiting, and experiencing diarrhea for 5 days. A physician gave her the drug Phenergan. Later that night, Nikki had a temperature of 103.1 degrees. In response to this troubling development, Robert brought Nikki to a pediatrician the next morning, January 29. Her temperature at this time was 104.5 degrees. The physician sent Nikki home with cough syrup containing codeine, as well as another prescription for Phenergan. The Bowmans agreed to take Nikki and keep her for 2 nights because Robert's girlfriend Teddy had to go into the hospital for a hysterectomy. As it turns out, the Bowmans only kept Nikki for 1 night because Verna Bowman was not feeling well. Robert picked Nikki up on January 30 and took her back to his house. After arriving, he put Nikki to bed. Her mattress sat on cinder blocks and was 24 inches from the floor. On the next day, January 31, Teddy called Robert and told him that she had been discharged and was ready to be picked up. Robert explained that he needed to make a trip to the hospital anyway because Nikki was not breathing. Teddy told Robert to bring Nikki to the hospital immediately and met them upon their arrival. Hospital staff realized that Nikki was unresponsive. They performed CPR, intubated Nikki, and restarted her heart. On life support, Nikki was transported to Dallas Children's Hospital, where she was pronounced dead the next day, February 1, 2002. The police asked Robert what happened. Here's what he told them. Early on January 31, he heard Nikki crying, so he checked on her. She was on the floor and had a small amount of blood on her mouth. He wiped it off and put her back in bed. Later that morning, Robert woke up and found Nikki unresponsive. Her lips were blue. Robert shook her, tried to revive her, then drove her to the hospital. Both the police and the staff at the hospital thought that Robert did not have the correct emotions, given the circumstances. His affect was flat, and he did not seem to be concerned at all about his daughter's condition. On February 2, 2002, the medical examiner performed an autopsy on Nikki and concluded her death was a homicide. In April, Robert was indicted for capital murder. In February 2003, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Over the years, Robert has fought to overturn his conviction. His last appeal was rejected on September 11, 2024. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals claimed that Robert's appeal did not meet the procedural requirements for a subsequent appeal for habeas relief. The merits of his claim were not even reviewed. At the time I'm making this video, Robert is scheduled to be executed on October 17, 2024. Now moving to my analysis. Robert Robertson maintains his innocence, and he has a massive number of supporters. They argue that no crime was ever committed. Nikki died from something other than intentional homicide. The state, of course, disagrees. They argue that Robert was an emotionless criminal with a history of harmful behavior toward Nikki. This brings me to the question, was Robert guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Robert had been arrested at least 17 times prior to Nikki's death. He had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for burglary of a habitation, 5 years for theft by check, and 7 years for theft by worthless check. He had also violated the terms of his parole. When Nikki died, Robert was on parole, having been released from prison in the year 2000. Robert's ex-wife, Della, said that Robert physically mistreated her. He allegedly strangled her with a coat hanger, punched her in the face, and beat her with a fireplace shovel. Robert's girlfriend, Teddy, said that Robert had a temper and would yell at Nikki when she cried. The yelling was frequent because Nikki would cry every single time Robert approached her. Robert once yelled at Nikki, quote, "If you don't shut up, I'm going to beat your blank," unquote. Teddy observed Robert hit Nikki with his hand and with a paddle. He would sometimes pick Nikki up from her bed, shake her for a few seconds, and throw her back on the bed. Teddy's niece, who sometimes spent the night in Robert's home, said that she witnessed Robert shake Nikki by the arms to make her stop crying. Teddy's daughter Rachel said that she witnessed Robert shaking and spanking Nikki on 10 occasions. The circumstances surrounding Nikki's death make it seem like Robert was involved. He was the only one with Nikki when she sustained mortal injuries. The Bowmans claim that Nikki was just fine when Robert picked her up on January 30. Robert's story about Nikki dying due to falling 24 inches to the floor was so unbelievable, even his defense attorneys rejected it at trial. As a matter of fact, his attorneys did not even contest the assertion that Nikki died due to Robert shaking her. They focused on creating reasonable doubt about Robert's intent. Robert demonstrated no sense of urgency to get Nikki to the hospital. When Teddy called to get a ride home from the hospital, Robert mentioned that Nikki was not breathing. What would have happened if Teddy had not called? How long would Robert have waited before getting help for Nikki? Robert dressed Nikki before taking her to the hospital, and instead of pulling up to the emergency room, he parked his vehicle and walked in. Nikki had bruising on the left side of her jaw. A CT scan showed a subdural hematoma and brain swelling. A physician said that Nikki had a single minor impact site on the back right side of her head and concluded that Nikki died of shaken baby syndrome. Moving to the exculpatory factors, the emotionless and nonchalant behavior exhibited by Robert could be explained by autism spectrum disorder. Robert did have a long history of criminal behavior, but his crimes were nonviolent. The credibility of Robert's ex-wife Della can be called into question. She lost custody of their 2 children and allegedly had a history of substance use. Nikki had a number of medical problems, including several antibiotic-resistant infections and breathing apnea. Sometimes she would stop breathing, turn blue, and collapse. Nikki was given 2 drugs, Phenergan and codeine, which these days are not recommended for children her age and with her conditions. The autopsy did not reveal any skull fractures or neck injuries, even though the idea that Nikki died in a fall was dismissed by many people, including Robert's attorneys. A short-distance fall with head impact can seriously injure a child. 3 physicians who reviewed the case have concluded that Nikki died from viral and bacterial pneumonia, which progressed to sepsis, then to septic shock. Even if these physicians are wrong, another illness, inappropriate medications, or a short fall could have killed Nikki. Either way, there was no murder. The state's case was built on the validity of shaken baby syndrome, or SBS. However, it is not necessarily a valid construct. To understand why, we have to take a look at the history of SBS. In the 1970s, 2 physicians developed the shaken baby syndrome hypothesis. They argued that shaking a baby could cause subdural hematoma, which in turn would lead to death. This death could occur in the absence of any obvious explanation for internal bleeding. They believed that there were 3 telltale symptoms: bleeding under the dura, brain swelling, and retinal hemorrhages. If this triad of symptoms was observed, a physician could declare shaken baby syndrome as the cause of death. The child must have died from an intentionally inflicted head injury. Every time those symptoms were observed, there was a murder. The problem is there's a lack of evidence supporting this conclusion. This SPS hypothesis was rejected and never became theory. In the world of science, a theory is a well-substantiated explanation for some aspect of the natural world. The word theory is used differently in the vernacular, where it means a guess or an unproven idea. No study has ever found that shaking can produce internal head injuries, and conditions other than intentional killing can lead to the triad of symptoms. For example, the triad is associated with hypoxia. Even if one were to believe that the triad can occur due to shaking, it certainly does not happen in the absence of neck injuries. Again, Nikki did not have any neck injuries. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Robert was guilty of murder? Yes, I believe he was guilty in reality, but I am not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. It is plausible that Nikki died from a cause unrelated to Robert's actions. The shaken baby syndrome hypothesis, which has now been rejected, was a key part of him being convicted. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Whether Robert was guilty or not, his lack of emotional response, combined with the investment that medical personnel had in shaken baby syndrome, led to his conviction. Over time, people have become more compassionate toward individuals with mental disorders, and science has exposed the faulty assumptions surrounding SPS. Unfortunately, these developments came too late to save Robert. Unless he is given a pardon by the governor of Texas, Robert will be making his exit from this world. Robert said that he forgives the people who put him on death row. Forgiveness may flow from him, but mercy for him remains elusive. Robert took his chances by mistreating Nikki, and now he is ensnared in a system that cannot forgive him or forgive its own mistakes. Those are my thoughts in the case of Robert Roberson. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They consistently generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.